Margaret Mary O'Connor. Wow. Where do I begin? What a great conversation. Um, who was the most famous woman priest? Wonder if you know the answer to that. I don't know if I should spoil it for you, but it was Mary. And Margaret she's done a lot of research on the topic. As a young child, she was told that girls can't be, part of the Catholic Church in any priest way at all. She was yelled at once when she was was on the altar there in the church during choir practice, and her brother got some gifts, and she was shunned by the ideas of possibly being a priest. So she had this kind of calling, and she wrote a book in 2020, Scandal in the Shadows. She continues to pick it now. Just a wonderful perspective on women in the Catholic Church. I did ask her if she had an audience with the Pope, what would she say? And of course, through all this, of course, with the scandal with the sex abuse and women being treated this way, what keeps your faith? Why do you stay? So many are leaving, and what do you say to them? Fascinating discussion. Of course, given her age and her surroundings, discipline plays a very specific role as well. But it's a wonderful conversation. Wait till you hear the energy in Margaret's voice and the way she presents herself. It's quite incredible. Thanks for listening. Hi, I'm Joey Pinz. People ask me, how did I lose 130 pounds? The quick answer is always discipline. I started my business, wasn't paying attention to my health, was eating too much, drinking too much sweets. My daughter was born. Next thing I know, I'm pre-diabetic, I have hypertension. I knew something had to change. Discipline. I, like many of you, have faced many challenges in your career, in your family, in your life, in your faith. How did you attack them? How did you approach them? How did you solve them, hopefully? It all had to have some degree of discipline. I'm also asked, how did you found and start a tech business? And it lasted over 25 years. Discipline. I was committed to it, enjoyed technology, didn't enjoy some aspects of it, but knew it was necessary. Discipline. Our podcast mission, how do we use discipline to better ourselves and society? Join me, please, as I talk to interesting people and discuss how they use discipline in their family and their passion and their careers and how it helped them. Our podcast vision, growth through learning from others. Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations. It'll be light and serious. Join us, please. Thank you for consideration. I am so excited to talk to you, Margaret Mary O'Connor. Thank you so much for your time today. Who was the first woman priest?
The first woman priest, the most famous, and isn't it sad that your audience really doesn't have an answer for that? Believe it or not, and it comes from factual material, so I'm not making this up, is Jesus's mother, Mother Mary of God. And her title, she was known as Mary Priest, the model for all priesthood in the Catholic Church. And there's certainly a lot to unpack in there. And I just find this information so wonderfully exciting. But what has happened is our church fathers, obviously for centuries, have never disclosed this information. So for other Catholic women out there, men, who is this lady? Does she have a doctorate in theology? Where are you coming up with this information? But they will also ask, okay, now maybe that was an honorary title because Mary was Jesus's mother.
Sure.
Well, believe it or not, both Jesus and Mary were never ordained. At the time of Mary's conception, the Holy Spirit, she received the same blessing, that anointing from the Holy Spirit that Jesus did. And in other words, after Jesus, she is the first high priest.
And this is not mentioned in the Bible, correct?
Yes, and that is a very major sticking point.
Yes.
This is coming from biblical research. In other words, whether it's archaeology, the study of monuments and artifacts, or the various papyrus scripts, or even looking at the epigraphy, the actual inscriptions found on monuments. But this is factual in nature. So then maybe you're wondering, okay, well, who exactly are these individuals that are doing this biblical research?
Mm,
There are male Catholic priests, there are woman religious sisters, there are Protestant ministers, ministers of all denominations. And it truly captures for the reader a whole new perspective of the Catholic Church, something that they have never seen before. But more importantly, for their own spirituality, particularly with women, it is affording them a new avenue. But unfortunately, right now, that is going nowhere because the Catholic Church, through centuries, has completely come out with one definitive statement:
mm,
there never were women priests. And when I was a young girl, I heard what I would consider rumors that, older women talking about women priests. And that went on my whole life. But I had some experiences when I was young that really um, hit me in that, gee, there's a big difference. I was only a young girl then. What girls can do in the church and what boys can do in the
mm.
church. And my mother, for a birthday gift, she actually gave my brother Paul, it was a cardboard replica of a church altar. And I remember my brother Paul, he assumed the role of the priest, of course, and he told us to get chairs. So we brought chairs and we sat down in front of this, altar, and we were to be the parishioners. And I forget how much time elapsed, probably not much because, again, I was maybe 4 or 5. But all of a sudden, I can remember that. I stood up and I said, Paul, I want to be the priest. And I remember, you're girls, you can't be priest, you have to be a man. So that, whoa, that, really was very indelible. And then
Mm.
at another time, my mother was a church organist, and they had like weekly choir practice. I think it was a Tuesday evening. And after the other members left, my mother asked myself and my twin sister, Pat, would you like to go down on the altar? And, stand behind the altar. Well, back in the 1950s, you never saw a woman up on the altar.
Really?
So this was wow, we were getting excited. So my twin sister had her chance, and I barely just got centered behind the altar. And I'm looking out, and the strangest thought came to my mind. This must be wonderful on a weekend because back then the pews were completely packed to people. And all of a sudden I hear this gruff voice. What are those girls doing on the altar?
Wow.
And that was the Monsignor, and I knew he was my mom's boss, so I was, getting nervous. And my mother really wasn't one to like rock the boat, but she said back to them or back to him, "You're right, Father, except when they're cleaning the altar." Well, his face got
Mm.
beet red, and thank God he left the church. But there's
Hmm.
just, I mean, there was no need to be so dismissive of young girls like we were committing mortal sin or who
Mm.
knows, what. Uh, there just wasn't, it was really sad. So I had those personal experiences. So then we get to be a certain age, and I'm still hearing there were women priests. So I thought, I'm going to find out. But finally, it wasn't until I was actually reading books that dealt with biblical research. And that's literally when the floodgates opened to this wonderful new information. And there's one book by a former UK priest, John Vinsgaard's The Ordination of Woman in the Catholic Church. And he has a chapter on Mary in there. And that's where I read this information about Mary. She was a woman priest, and I had the book in my hand. I threw it up in the air. And then, of course, I had to gather it. Did I really just see or read what I thought I did? But in that moment of wonderful excitement, then unfortunately, there was this awful feeling because this realization came over me that I had been lied to
Mm,
by my church of all groups,
mm,
organizations. And being Irish, it didn't set very well. But
no.
after about a month, I realized I got to get out of this like funk because it's not doing me any good. And then I thought, this is just wonderful information. And right now, I think they say there's 2 billion Catholics worldwide. Well, there's other women that know this, but the majority of those other billions of women, whether we're here in the United States or we're in Ireland, anywhere across the world, they have never heard of this information. And I thought, this isn't right. So basically, it was my conscience that initially led me to write my Scandal in the Shadows book because I don't care what church you belong to, what denomination. I feel as a woman or even a man, if it was maybe perhaps a different subject area, you deserve the truth.
Mm. And did this ever make you question the faith itself?
I always believe in God, but
Mm,
it did definitely highlight how dysfunctional our church over the centuries have become. Because I
mm,
mean, let's face it, when Jesus was around, he was always surrounded by women that went with him, and he allowed women to do things, and he even talked to them, and whether they were Jewish or not, if they were pagan, and he of all people spoke up against at his time the religious authorities if he believed something was wrong. And in a sense, that's what I feel like I'm doing. I'm actually speaking up against the hierarchy
hmm,
uh, of our church. And I know when I began to write the book, there was a certain point that all of a sudden it hit me. Oh my God, I'm going against the Catholic Church. And of course, now this is like a big business.
mm,
Um, but what really saved me, in a sense, or gave me the courage to move forward was I knew I had the truth behind me.
hmm,
And if you do have the truth behind you, then it really gives you that like armor, if you will, extra courage to come forward. But it definitely, if I'm out on a picket line, let's just say I've heard some we'll keep it polite, I've heard some discouraging words. But, some of the things which aren't, that bad, but, obviously you're crazy and you belong in that other church and you're a heretic. You, you're the one that's breaking our church apart. Like all the problems there, I caused them. Um, but people's anger, or you can just feel like the cold ice as they walk by you. I mean, you can just pick up like the body image, And then there's one man, I can remember him year after year. Uh, we would picket at the ordination of young men. Not that that's fine, they want to become a priest, that's wonderful. But it's the idea, well, where are the women
Mm,
in this procession?
mm,
And it's specifically from the biblical research that it's proven, okay, what were these women doing back in the earliest centuries of our church? They did have religious positions, whether they were woman bishops, woman deacons, or woman priests.
mm.
And that's why when you look at the whole aspect of that question today, I mean, what the church is saying and what we know actually happened, it's like day and night. And it's just awful. To me, it's like a hidden history. And by them coming out, as I say, centuries ago, making that one statement, there never were women priests, they have not been bothered by the press or the general laity. And they still have just such a tie. It's like an ironclad thing with the laity. Because, like you mentioned earlier, Joe, about the is it in the Bible or I couldn't
Mm,
find it in the Bible? Well, if I don't have the Bible card, then this biblical research means absolutely nothing, even
mm.
though it is factual and is indeed the actual truth, but it's like completely lost.
Yeah, and as far as that subject, I mean, there's plenty of doctrine followed by the Catholic Church. It's not like Trinity is not in the Bible, I believe, right? But that's I'm just kind of following up your point there.
Mhm.
But how can you help? How can you help others that have given space with the Catholic Church, not only because of this female issue, but of course with the priests and the pedophilia issue and these kinds of things. What do you say to them that have separated themselves? You want them to come back? What do you say to them?
I just say to them that if you want to make any difference, because it is refreshing after some pickets, there are individuals that will come over and question me or other ladies that are there, which is wonderful because obviously that's the only reason. And then we give them these specific names of these books, with the biblical research pertaining to
Mm,
women. And I say to them, you have to understand the actual history behind this issue. And when you realize the truth, I'm hoping then that that is going to personally hit a chord within themselves, their conscience. And I really think the whole issue has always been for centuries the Catholic Church hierarchy has never been held accountable. And with this issue of the woman priest, I mean, they're just like, who was that mafia figure, the Don, whatever,
Al Capone.
Al Capone, and then there was another one in New York City. But anyway, they're just untouchable.
Mm,
But if we ever had, forget billions, just millions of American Catholics all of a sudden questioning the hierarchy, well, why aren't you telling us the truth?
hmm.
Why have you been hiding this? And they have no, like, pressure to change anything. And then another, fascinating thing is back in 1903, there was, Pope Leo the 13th, and he was allowed to actually hang a painting of Mary Priest, obviously, she would have been dressed in priestly attire, on the wall. But in 1913, things were changing. All of a sudden, that wasn't allowed. And then in 1927, and at that time, my mother and grandmother were alive and they never heard of this story. The hierarchy of the Catholic Church completely remove the title from Mary, Mother of God, as being the model for all priesthood.
Hmm.
And John Vingegaards asked, well, why, insinuated, why was this year so important? And he says, is it just a coincidence? But back then, there were women from other church denominations that as well were demanding that they become women priests.
Hmm.
But I thought, really, I mean, what kind of nerve do you have to remove a title from Jesus's mother? I mean, do these men believe in
Mm.
hell? Or, I mean, what are they going to say to Jesus? Well, why did you take that
Hmm.
title away from my mom? But I thought, and then this was even more sickening, at least from my view. Um, they ran a little article on one of the Roman papers. And basically, some priest from the Vatican was like praising how the newspaper officials took care of this question. And isn't it? It's important that you did that, so because this is such a question that even the regular laity wouldn't be able to understand. I'm reading this, and I'm thinking, you're calling Mary, Mother of God, a question?
Mm.
You're referring to her like an object? So,
Hmm.
just unbelievable. So that was in another sense that completely, but I found it very interesting that, as I say, my mother and grandmother were still alive in 1927, and they never heard anything, knew anything about the title Mary, Mother of God, or the fact that, that was taken away from her.
And that generation, Margaret, the church was so integrated into society. You mentioned that your brother got an altar for his birthday, and it was just my grandparents are from Europe, and it was very similar. I mean, they went to church
Mm,
almost every day. Just they would light the candles, and of course on Sunday was more, but it was just such part of their lives. But again, through all of this, I follow a couple of Christian leaders. I don't know what you want to call them, but
mhm.
a lot of them make the sense of, follow Jesus. Don't necessarily follow the teachings of many of these specific men. Uh, eh, so again, I kind of ask you, through all this and through this kind of hypocrisy of these men, and obviously there's good and there's bad, but it never made you actually question your faith at all.
No, because my faith is in the person of Jesus Christ.
Mm, mm,
But it's very upsetting then to be in a church that supposedly is supposed to be representing not only Jesus
mm,
Christ, but his morals,
mm.
his very ideals, his truth, his compassion. And like as you mentioned with the pre-sexual abuse issue, I am completely dumbfounded because there's times when I pick it, there's only three individuals. There's been myself, another man who was abused, and another woman victim that was sitting on a walker. And out of the whole diocese of Buffalo, you have three individuals out there trying to bring up this issue of holding the church accountable.
Mm,
And I know that, let's face it, wherever money's involved, it's not only the Catholic Church, it's the Boy Scouts, whatever
mm,
groups.
mm.
The snakes will come out from under
Right.
the rocks to get some money. But the general number of people, if you really listen to their story, you just see it in their demeanor. I mean, how this has just literally destroyed their lives.
Mm,
And why aren't these other Catholics coming forward to, like, in a sense, show support to other parents whose children were abused? It's uh, it's very disheartening. And at this one picket, these individuals of this church, they had to be coached. Why would you have every single parishioner coming up again, there was the three of us, and asking, "Where's your proof?
Mm.
Show me your proof." Well, of course, I wasn't a victim, so I'd say, "Well, I'm not a victim." But then for the other two that were victims, can you imagine
Mm.
how and then to be out there for a good hour and constantly hearing that these other people are questioning and, "Well, that's not so." And that was the only church that ever happened. But
Mm.
this one priest came out, young priest, and he didn't want any part of us there. He whipped out a cell phone and said, "We will see how long you'll be standing at this corner. I'm going to call the police." So the man who had been abused said, "Well, Father, go right ahead." And you could see it sort of caught him off guard.
Mm.
But he went back to the rectory and he called the police. So once he sees the police cars there, at first it started out with one police car, then there was two, three. And then as we got into the middle of this, oh my God, we took a count. There were 10 police cars. And when the priest came back down to question the policeman to, in other words, remove us, the policeman said, "We're here. We need to protect these picketers. You need to get your people under control."
Mm.
Yeah. So, but it's just amazing that older people, I know it must be extremely hard because they're just been, like you said, ingrained that the priest is like God, and they couldn't do anything.
Mm.
But I guess one lady really said I should be ashamed of myself, and I said, "Ashamed of myself? Now, why is it right for priests to be raping children?" And then she drove off in her car. I mean, what do they think? It's sad, but between that, obviously, if you've been a victim like that, and then the church like lying that they didn't do anything, and we know now bishops, it had like a chessboard and kept moving everyone. If it was in Buffalo, they move them out to Orchard Park, they move out to West Seneca, wherever, just all around, and now they got a whole new batch of victims in a sense. Um, and that's the whole thing. The bishop has the discretion. When he finds out a priest has supposedly, done something like this, he can call it a sin or a crime. And if he calls it a crime, then obviously the
Mm.
priest would be handcuffed, booked, arrested. But you don't see that. It's always a sin. So I have and that's why I feel discussions like this, I'm just trying to bring the truth out of these issues that why are we allowing this? Why are we not holding the hierarchy accountable to try to make some change? And we're just constantly on this issue. They're constantly coming up, but this in no way, especially the sexual abuse issue. It's not going away, sadly, anytime soon.
You made an important distinction there, Margaret. So the Catholic Church said that those guilty priests, it wasn't a crime, it was a sin.
Mhm.
Therefore, if it was a crime, it would fall under the laws of the nation, of the state, etc. But they said it was a sin, which is a type of crime against the church. So by making that distinction, they weren't they weren't culpable in matters of state and crime. It's horrible.
No, they're just given a free ticket, and then if they get to a point that they've exhausted, like, let's say, suburbs to move this priest to, well, then they'll ship him over maybe somewhere. I forget if where there's different a few areas. There's one in Canada, I think there's one in Florida, somewhere else. Supposedly, they're treatment centers. And that's a big joke too, because a lot of them really, it's just somewhere to house them. They're not receiving the proper, what would you call
Care,
it? Treatment, mental,
treatment, care,
yeah, or
yeah.
something for their. So it just goes on and on. And you think of like Buffalo is only one diocese. You go to Cleveland, you go Ohio, you go to Michigan, you go to Cincinnati, go all across anywhere in the country, and then you do that same thing all across the country. It's just run rampant.
And of course, the Hollywood movie Spotlight, mostly took place in Boston, was very kind of
Yes,
opening. I think it won an Oscar, if I'm not mistaken. Um, so in 2020 March, you mentioned their book Scandal in the Shadows. What do you hope the reader takes away from that?
I want them, especially a woman, to finally understand that the woman priest issue is not one-sided. In
Mm,
other words, it's not what they've heard that, "Look it, there never were a woman priest," that it has a whole other wonderful side to it. And beyond learning that women factually had these priestly roles, there's something else which hits one very hard. If you look at the Catholic Church, let's pretend in the left pews are the men, the right pews are the women. For centuries, we know in Catholic families, again, I happen to be Irish, so maybe in one generation, Sean is a priest, Christopher is a bishop, Liam is a cardinal. But this went on generation after generation within families. So males always had a role model, not only within their families when they went to church. So now we go over to the other side where the women are. Well, we had Mary, but we never knew she was a woman priest.
mm,
And then it took until about 1969 for the church to finally get Mary Magdalene, get the story right on that one. Uh, but sadly, where, as a woman in the Catholic Church, is our own religious heritage. And this is where it really cuts hard. If you're a woman, and yes, we can receive the same call as men from Jesus. Well, if you're in the Catholic Church, that is going absolutely nowhere.
mm,
And that's why they've done surveys and they found the largest group of Catholics leaving the church recently are millennial women that were in their 30s because they can just see the hypocrisy
mm,
and they've just basically had it. And I think the church officials should be worried too, because where are you going to get your new congregants?
mm,
You know, if you have so many women like that of that age leaving the church, but it is sad because we have been robbed. We've
mm.
been robbed of our religious heritage, and we have been duped. And I know some people get upset when I say that, but okay, we've been lied to. But no matter what way you cut it, this isn't right. We are in 2024. We are
Mm,
not back in the dark ages,
mm,
the Middle Ages, although for women it certainly feels um, like we're still there. And then going back again, which is very recent to us in 2,000 years of church history, 1976, the Pope has his own commission and it's called the Pontifical Biblical Commission. And they looked at the very question of women becoming priests in our Catholic Church. And they came out with a definitive statement that there's absolutely no biblical reason to prevent women from being ordained.
mm.
All right, that's 1976. Here we go again. We're at 2024. And here's where this issue of accountability comes. This church should have been held accountable years ago because it's just, it's sad to say it really hasn't been on the church radar. It's
Mm,
as simple as that. And it all stems back to women's inequality in our church. Jesus, well, in Genesis in 127, in the divine image, God made female and male. God, created them. And then, of course, in Galatians, it mentions different things. There are no men or women, all are one in Christ Jesus.
Mm.
And Vatican II had a council, the church in the modern world, and Article 29, in so many words, specifically said they wanted to remove all types of discrimination, whether sexual, racial, in the Catholic Church. Well, we know if they would have followed up on that, uh, the woman issue would have been taken care of. The woman issue wouldn't even be an issue if they would have moved forward on the 76 findings of no biblical reason for women to become priests. God has said that women are made in the image of God,
Mm.
and yet one of the five major reasons why women can't be priests is that women are not made in God's image. And all of these 5 points have nothing to do, are not biblical, rather, they're cultural prejudice. And then the second one that, that women shouldn't be teaching. And I found it ironic at that same time within the Roman culture, there was a civil law. And this particular condition affected not men, but it affected women.
Mm.
And women were so feeble minded, so emotionally unstable.
Mm.
We couldn't have them out talking out in public. I mean, it's just absurd. And then the issue of Eve committing the sin. And of course, let's face it, if women are seen as being sinful,
Mm.
well, then I guess they're not the best stellar
Mm.
candidates for the priesthood. But of course, miraculously, there was a group of men within the church that were the perfect candidates. And then the idea that Jesus only chose 12 apostles. And that issue is Jesus did choose 12 men to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And John Vinsgard's made this point in particular. He said, when Jesus was around in ancient Israel, it was a very patristic region.
Mm.
And he just never could have appointed 12 women. He himself would have been run over some cliff.
Mm.
Um, but that wasn't to mean that he didn't mean that women, couldn't have roles like that. But they just took that one thing and it was like distorted. And then finally, that you have to be a man to like consecrate the host to be up on the altar. And there again, um, it's just cultural in nature. Women are equal. Even our baptism in our church, let's face it, if you're a baby boy or a girl, you're receiving the same baptism, the same
Mm.
blessings, the anointings. Um, and where does that leave us as a woman? We're still unequal. And these are just blatant points that our Catholic Church hierarchy should really come out and say, look, we apologize. These 12 points, they aren't biblical. They're cultural prejudice. But of course, then that would be that won't happen until the church is being held accountable
Mm.
for what they haven't done. But I guess I want to look at the perspective, hopefully, to let the audience try to see this issue. Forget about like all these past arguments I just brought up about stuff being biblical, instead it was cultural. Look only from the perspective of 1976. There's no biblical reason to prevent women from becoming, woman priest.
Mm.
Uh, well, then why do we get caught up in all these other arguments? Why don't we ask the church authorities? Well, we deserve an answer. Too much time has been lost. Too many women were never able to answer their call to God. and it simply, it's not right. And I am not, so many times women will say, well, she's telling us we should be woman priests. No, Joe. I just want them to know that there's actually a whole other side to this issue, and it shouldn't be contentious as it is. I realize Catholics that hear this for the first time, in a sense, feel they're defending their faith.
Mm.
They're defending their church, and I believe that's why they get so upset. But if they could just step back and momentarily think about this other information, which is not in no way, make believe, it's factual, and what that would really mean for their faith, not only for their faith, but for their young children, for their girls growing up. Can you imagine having Mary Priest as a model? I mean, you couldn't have any better
Mm.
model. I don't know.
Margaret, if I could grant you an audience with the Pope for a half hour, what would you tell him?
I would tell him I really like his initiative on the synod. In other words, getting the view of the average everyday Catholic out in the pew, in what they want. And I would very much obviously press him with the Biblical Commission's findings from 1976, because only having a half hour, we want to focus right on that, and that, other things, but um,
Hmm.
that it's time. And in a sense, Pope Francis reminds me of John the 23rd. I can remember I was a young girl during Vatican II, and it was wonderful, not because I didn't know Latin, but before you were always looking at the back of the priest, and then now the priest is turned around. It's more personal. You were able to understand the English. But one of the most exciting parts about Vatican II was, again, they did biblical research. And the way that our current Mass is today, that is the closest to what like a Mass would be back in the earliest centuries of our church.
Hmm.
But it was unfortunate when Vatican II was rolled out. I think they needed some type of a PR system to, explain to Catholics, what we found through this biblical research, and what we're trying to bring you, how the early Christians of our faith, what their worship was, and then understanding these other constitutions within the church. But that sadly was lost because Pope John the 23rd then had cancer. So then there was another pope after him, Pope Paul VI, that took over, and it just never it lost so much. And here's the kicker: Pope what was his name?
Paul?
Pope Paul VI. He initiated this like a commission, and they were look into the role of women in the church. This
Hmm.
would have been back in 1973. But there was one major point that they could not talk about, this commission, and that was woman becoming priest. So, I mean, the deck was stacked, let's face it.
So they wanted to find out how women could be more active in the church, but not about becoming priests.
Yes,
Wow.
it's miraculous. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
And again, I you mentioned before how millennial women leaving, and uh, you say what to them? You make a point of saying you never question your faith in Jesus, just that these people that kind of came and represent him, you have questions that you question sometimes.
And
But
that's
you
why
say
we
the same
need
thing.
That's why we need you to come back, or initially forget about coming back because obviously they've been very hurt. But
Yeah.
to send postcard, if every individual listening would send a postcard to Rome and just question why, if the Pope's commission in 76 said there's no biblical reason to prevent women from becoming priest, well, why hasn't that happened?
Mm, mm.
We have to somehow make them accountable, and that will not happen until the average everyday Catholics like myself learn this truth, and then in their conscience realize, step back and then look, well, how is this affecting um, our church?
So Margaret, I'm from New Haven, just due east of you, and I started my business in the '90s, and I was working way too much and not paying attention to my spiritual self or my well-being. I was eating unhealthy, and I got myself up to 340 pounds, just not following particular good diet and just working too much. And the doctor said to me, if I don't lose the weight, I'm not going to see my daughter graduate. I have this beautiful daughter. So I took the next 6 or 7 months. I lost 130 pounds. People ask me how I did it, and I always say discipline. That's how I lost. There's no secret. So I wonder, given your background, your relationship with the church, and specifically what we've been talking about, how does discipline play a role in your life?
I see it in a sense like I'm in a lane. Let's pretend we're out on a highway.
Hmm.
And I know my lane because over the years, I have found discipline, self discipline, in a sense, like a tool.
Hmm.
And it could be just something as simple as you have to get a report done. Well, then you allot this much time, or you have to work on this. And it's always been nice in my case because it really it puts me in a certain zone, and it frees me in a way that I know I'm doing whatever. Even when I was writing my book, I allotted like so much time. Oh, now I got to do research, that. But I think as well, it depends on uh, your passion for the project, obviously, that you're in. Um, but it's just like a something in your toolkit. That's how I see it.
Something in your toolkit that you could dispense when needed.
Definitely.
Has the church helped mold that, or you were brought up that way?
My mother was very religious.
Hmm.
Yes, and I remember I asked her years after that. I said, "How did you get the courage to, speak up?" And she said, "Well, it just wasn't right. Who was he, questioning my young daughters and his whole attitude?" And then I told her I really appreciated, what
Hmm.
she did.
What's the difference between being religious and being spiritual?
Religious, I believe, pertains more to the church and their particular laws, but spiritual is your relationship, your personal relationship with Jesus.
Hmm.
And that is so much, uh, so different because, particularly in times like this, when you just see this major gap between this organization that, God forgive me, I call them so called men of God,
Hmm.
because there's so many in that position that aren't. Uh, but if you have that connection with Jesus, it truly is like a lifeline. That it's something that there you can grasp. It means everything to you.
Do you consider yourself more religious or more spiritual?
More spiritual.
Hmm. So in December of 21, you released another book with your battle with celiac disease and your second chance.
Yeah, and that was that. When I started writing that book, I was actually into the middle of that, and that was gonna be my first book.
Hmm.
And then I had this unusual experience. No, I wasn't hearing voices, but it was thoughts, and it was particular phrases. Woman priest, woman's ministry. It got it started out every day a few times, and then within a few days, it was incessant.
Hmm.
And it got to be so annoying that I had to completely stop writing the Scandal in the Shadows book, and then, you know, or I mean, Journey of a Celiac Soul book and go
Right.
over to Scandal in the Shadows. But it just was ironic how that worked out. But basically, I went 20 years with an undiagnosed autoimmune disease. And I was within 5 to 6 months of being, as the doctor said, 6 feet under.
Mm.
So I'm very lucky. I have a second chance at life. And my twin sister, Pat, unfortunately, she had brain cancer. So she never had that choice. But I want the listeners out there to know that it's hard for them because they hear celiac disease and they hear it as some type of a fad diet. And of course, this comes along like with the movie stars or tennis players. But basically, if I ingest wheat, rye, barley, or even oats, if those oats aren't grown on a separate field, I just become so sick.
Mm.
And like I was down to about 98 pounds
Wow.
when I was diagnosed with celiac disease. Because what happens is you can eat and eat, you have a voracious appetite, but within your small intestine, there's these like villi, these wavy projections, and they're there to gather in your food nutrients. But by eating wheat, your body, for some reason, sees it like an invader.
Hmm.
And over time, that basically rubs off away all those projections on your small intestine. So you're eating and eating, and you're getting in absolutely no nutrient value. Like Dr. O'Brien said, think of it like your track from your mouth down the other way. Say it's lined with shag carpeting. Well, over time, that shag becomes Berber. So, but he said, if you want to continue living, you have to stay on this diet. And that's a whole other issue. People hear diet so normally.
Mm.
What do you think of? Losing weight.
Right.
It's there for us to keep our weight on. But then this whole issue involves the communion wafer. Years ago, the church only had the regular wheaten host. Then they came up with a low gluten host. And Dr. Alessio Fasano said even 0.01% of gluten for some individuals is too much.
Mm.
And there's a whole group of individuals like myself. We can't consume that low gluten host, but the church has come out with this other communion host. So for them, uh, the issue is completely um, taken care of. So unless I can find an open-minded priest that will allow me, to put a gluten-free food in my pyx on the altar, then I can't receive communion.
Hmm.
So that's very hard too. Knowing that Jesus healed the sick,
Right.
Jesus took care of the sick. So I have different things going uniquely going on within my faith. But what was that? Jesus said he will only give you what you can handle.
Handle. Yeah.
So he better stop.
Do you think, Margaret, that if you didn't hear those disparaging things that girls can't be, a priest, or if you didn't hear those things, do you think to the right now you'd be a priest?
When I was young, I did have thoughts of that. But again, that was woo, wiped
Yeah.
out
Yeah.
because I mean it was the reality of it.
Margaret Mary O'Connor, what motivates you?
I get very excited about history. I love to look back into history and
Hmm.
particularly subject areas. And it is ironic looking back into history in regards to woman priests. Um, this is where, through biblical research, I find it really fascinatingly wonderful because even though our Catholic Church has never acknowledged the early centuries of woman priest, in other words, they have this whole history, they've never acknowledged it. Biblical research will take us into that time frame, and that's where we definitively find these women in these priestly roles. And no matter what it is, if you find something new, it's exciting.
Hmm. And with internet, with World Wide Web, with YouTube, it's a great time to have a lot of these resources available to you very quickly,
Oh,
history
yeah,
wise.
it's quite a difference,
Yes.
from from years ago.
Hmm. How do you measure success, Margaret?
I think that's very dependent, on the individual, uh, person, uh, in pertaining to whatever, um, goal that you might be working on.
Hmm.
You obviously, have made some type of an outline and put down specifics that will hopefully get you to reach what you're attaining to, or even beyond that. Um, and then if you indeed do that, well, then I think your reward personally would be a great sense of personal achievement. Um, but then you want to remember when you do reach your success, that it doesn't end there, that you should reflect back to what were those, maybe you honed in more and changed something here or
Hmm.
crafted something there, so that you can give that to other individuals that as well, again, depending on what the subject area is. If it's something that, like in my case, say it was Catholic Church or whatever, that I knew what I was talking about, that I could impart that to them, and then hopefully they would reach their success, and then as well, they would give that to someone else, to keep it going, because let's face it, we're only, as good as the people around us,
Hmm.
the people that really help us.
So excited when we set this up, Margaret. Thank you so much for your time. I love the topic. I love your spirit. I love, many people were just kind of accepted this and just moved on and not wrote a book and not picketed and not go on podcasts and discuss it. But you didn't. You still do it, and it's your passion, and it's wonderful to see. Anybody who's listening, how can they get in touch with you?
Yes, they can go to yourradicaltruth.com, yourradicaltruth.com. And there they will see not only my blogs, I do have a podcast show, Your Radical Truth. So if you really want to further your Catholic knowledge, this is the place to go to. And thank you again. It's really been a pleasure, Joe.
I appreciate it so much. And if next time I'm in the greater Buffalo area, perhaps we'll get together and have a cup of tea.
Yes, we'll have green tea.
It'll be wonderful. Thank you, Margaret. You be well.
Thank you. You too, Joe.
Thank you for listening and or viewing Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations. Please share this episode with one or two of your friends who you think may benefit from the episode. Our website, www.joeypins.com. There you'll find lots of resources and you could join our mailing list. Please follow us on all our social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Podcast information, the video version of our podcast is on YouTube. Please subscribe. Audio is on all major podcasting platforms. Please follow them. And if you like it, please consider giving 5-star rating. Would really appreciate that. Would you like to financially support the podcast? You can go to our Patreon site. Consider $5, $10, or $20 a month. There's all kind of plans that we have there. There's like a one-time payment. What is this podcast episode worth to you? $25, $50, $100, $500, $1,000, $5,000. You be the judge. You can go to our PayPal account to do that as well. Thank you again for listening or watching Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations.